to another one of DPA's ongoing series of seminars. And today we're going to have Dr. Shailendra Singh from the University of South Pacific School of Journalism to talk to us. Before we get to that, I would like to go through some of our typical housekeeping issues, and to begin, of course, with an acknowledgement of country. I'd like to acknowledge and celebrate that we are today meeting here in Canberra on the land of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people. I would like to acknowledge their leaders, past, emerging, and present, and all of those First Nations peoples from the Canberra region. Shailendra Singh is a high-profile journalist from Fiji, who has worked extensively with the Fiji Times and with the Review of Pacific Business and the Fiji Live website, as well as heading the Department of Journalism at USP. We're very happy to have him here today to present to us about the challenges that Pacific journalism is facing at this moment. We have a number of, I guess, intersecting crises in the region. So it's a very timely presentation. So without further ado, please, I'll just hand it over to Shailendra.
Okay, thank you, Thiago, sorry. It is such a privilege to be here this week, even in the cold. And I'm looking forward to sharing my experiences with you about Pacific journalism. So I will look at Pacific media through anecdotes, some research, as well as events, to piece together a sort of like an overview, the way I see it. Okay, of course, I won't be able to cover everything, and not even enough of everything. But let's see how we go, okay? So if we, can we have the next slide now? If we group Pacific media, they fall under small or micro media systems. And the category, and this is characterized by the following challenges: resource constraints, small audiences. If you look at the two largest markets, media markets in the Pacific region, PNG has a total population of 4 million, and Fiji just under 1 million. So the audience is quite small, and you also have limited advertising markets. It's notoriously difficult to get any data on the advertising market, although this information is so important, because media's financial viability is directly linked to editorial independence. So the best I can do is in 2013, the Fiji advertising market, the total market, was estimated at 25 million. And this was by the Chief Executive Officer of Fiji TV at the time. The problem was the market had been stagnant for a number of years, while the cost of production had been going up every year. So see, with the Pacific media, they import all the units of production, from ink to newsprint, spare parts, as well as television shows. And they have to pay either in Australian dollars or American dollars. So you can see how challenging it is, the market. But there's also a dependence on the state for revenue. Right? Pacific Island governments are a major player in the economy. They are a major employer, as well as a major advertiser. And this is one of the major hazards of media systems in the Pacific, the media sector in the Pacific, the dependence on the state for revenue. And you will see what I mean later in my presentation. The other thing we have in small and micro media systems, including the Pacific, is a young, inexperienced, undertrained, and underqualified journalist cohort. And this is because of the reason for this is uncompetitive salaries, right? It's not that the media organizations do not want to pay well, they simply cannot compete with the other sectors in the economy. So journalists, they will hire journalists and they will train them, and after 3 or 4 years, even after 2 years, they might join a civil society organization or an international organization on a salary that's 3, even up to 4 times higher, right? So in Fiji, for example, the starting salary might be anywhere between 10 to 15,000. If you join a UN organization, you can get 80,000 a year. So the high journalist attrition in the Pacific is a major problem, one of the major problems in Pacific journalism and a feature of small media systems. Now, if all these problems weren't enough, in some countries, you have hostile governments to deal with. Okay, I won't mention which countries are right away. So far, Pacific media had adapted to and survived all these challenges, maybe because their small size was an advantage, right? Because of lower overheads. However, there's always a new problem in the horizon. And I will discuss today 3 trends that compounded all these pre-existing vulnerabilities. And I'm talking about, okay, so the 3 recent trends that I'm talking about is digital disruption. Digital disruption is not so recent, but it's ongoing. And it is fairly recent if you look at it. You also have COVID-19, and finally, China in the Pacific. Now, the impact of the first 2, digital disruption and COVID-19, has been devastating, right? But you don't hear much about it because news media, they don't report about themselves that much. The other reason you don't know about this really major event, a really negative event, a really damaging event in Pacific media is because of the lack of research. There's so much research that needs to be done in Pacific media, and there's so few of us doing that research. I mean, I suppose it's the same in many other sectors as well. But we are designing a research project, and today what I'm going to do is share some preliminary details with you. So first, let's look at the digital disruption. Digital disruption refers to the impact of new technologies, specifically the internet and social media, that is wrecking mainstream media financial model. Right? This is the financial model that was proven winner for the media. This is what the media had depended on for decades, and it was very profitable. It made the mainstream media not only rich, but also very powerful. And now this funding model is now under siege. This is a global phenomenon, and it hasn't spared Pacific media despite our smallness and remoteness. Right? So the Pacific media has been hit almost just as bad as what we are seeing happening in the larger Western countries. The impact is not only financial, but editorial as well. Let's look at the financial impact first. What has happened is that the audience and advertising migrated to social media, and there was a massive revenue loss, right? The likes of not seen before in the Pacific media sector. Editorially, the public abuse of social media has seen governments enact online safety law. So what's happening is news media, they are trapped in the crossfire of social media legislation. And this is even though journalists are not abusing social media by and large. And Chope Tarai, who's a PhD student here, as well as our friend, Mr. Kumar, they have written some papers about this, some very interesting papers and very interesting findings. So what this means is media's already restricted space is now even more confined. So media was already operating, Pacific media were already operating in a restricted space, and this is even worse. Okay, let's look at COVID-19 in a bit more detail. With COVID-19, again, the impact is both financial and editorial. So just like the digital disruption, COVID-19, again, the impact is financial as well as editorial, but COVID hit harder and faster, right? The impact was more immediate and more devastating. Financially speaking, advertising dried up overnight because economies came to a halt and advertising, whatever little advertising was left, dried up overnight. Financially speaking, so yeah, I was saying advertising died overnight. What happened was because of the reduced revenue, there were retrenchments and reduced hours, right? Again, the level of retrenchment and the reduced hours were unprecedented. Okay, some journalists have left the profession permanently from the feedback I've been getting. And this is a major blow in a region where journalists are scarce to begin with. Right? We don't even have enough journalists to begin with, especially experienced journalists. The editorial impact of COVID-19 was that media freedom watchdogs, what they have noticed and what they've been complaining about is that Pacific governments are using the COVID emergency to restrict information and also to hide negative news, right? For example, the inability to handle the crisis. This was a big issue in Fiji, but the military commander has simply doubled down and insisted that the government had good reasons to curtail the media. Okay, so partly maybe this argument was partly correct because there was some misinformation on the news media as well, but the general feeling was that the government was being opportunistic and also too heavy-handed. In Vanuatu, it even became illegal to publish COVID-19 stories without government approval. So COVID is an ongoing situation, and Pacific media have not fully recovered. And some of us are wondering if this is the final nail in the frail Pacific media coffin. Okay, so we will not know for sure without further research, but at least one Fiji newspaper, the Fiji Sun, is no longer publishing a daily edition, sorry, a Sunday edition. The feedback I got from the Fiji Times editor is that their salaries, the salaries of their journalists has been restored to normal. This I was informed last week, but they have lost 6 staff members in an already small newsroom, and the chances of getting them back is really difficult. So these are 2 recent trends to hit the mainstream media hard that we should be monitoring. We should be monitoring because of the link between financial viability and editorial independence. Right? We should always be mindful of this link. So profit should not be a dirty word in media and journalism. Right? Profit is very important. And this is why I'm emphasizing this point. Okay, next I discuss press freedom situation through the 2022 Reporters Without Borders Global Index. This is a well-established and fairly respected measure of press freedom internationally. So in 2022, 180 countries were assessed and 4 were from the Pacific. Fiji, PNG, and Tonga were deemed problematic, while Samoa came out satisfactory. The index factored restrictions on the media, the COVID restrictions on the media, as well as political pressure. What we learn is that the media situation in the three countries haven't improved now for a number of years. So the media are not healthy and their health is not improving. This is what we see from the latest report. And Fiji's situation is by far the worst because of the Punitive Media Act that has been in place since 2010. So if you look at the rankings, Fiji is 102. Right? And then if you look at PNG, which is also problematic, the ranking is 62, much better. And Tonga is 49. So because of the Punitive Media Act, Fiji is dubbed the riskiest Pacific country, the riskiest country in the Pacific to be a journalist. And in a recent article, Graham Dobell of The Strategist, right? He's also a former journalist, and he paid tribute to the quiet heroism of Fiji journalists. And the reason is because they've been taking huge risks for the last decade. Okay, next slide. Okay, still on media freedom, I'd like to dig a bit deeper into PNG. Now we'll look at media freedom from a different angle. And I reference research by Lasslett and other observations that indicate media itself can be a threat to the people's right to know. Right? So this threat to the media freedom is often overlooked. So based on content analysis, Lasslett compares a major PNG newspaper to a laundromat that is laundering the dirty news of the rich and powerful in PNG. Right? So this is very concerning. And this situation is likened to a systematic failure in the PNG press culture to report on major national issues. And some of these issues are land for enforced evictions, theft and landowner resources, and so forth. You can see that. Now, these are really serious issues in PNG. And the concern is that these issues are rampant, still rampant, while the media, the PNG media, might have become numb to them or fatigued. So this small PNG case study indicates that press freedom in the Pacific region is threatened, not just from outside, but also from within. Government and other powers don't have to do anything, or they don't have to do much, just neglect media training and development, and part of their work is already done. The point I'm trying to make is, it's one thing to criticize PNG journalists, but what are we doing to empower them to report these issues? Right? These are really complex issues. And also the question, who is supposed to empower the PNG journalists? Right? The media organizations that employ them won't do it. Will the PNG government do it? Unlikely. If the PNG government won't do it, whose responsibility is it? So these are very perplexing and very complex issues that the Pacific media are dealing with. And PNG is a very important country in the region with the largest media market in the Pacific, right? Besides Fiji. Okay, that leads me to the next topic, which is education and training. So there are 8 journalism schools in the Pacific region. That might sound like a lot, but all of them are struggling, right? Because of resource constraints and lack of expertise. In Fiji, you have the University of the South Pacific, which is the oldest journalism school in Fiji, 30 plus years. Then you have the Fiji National University program, which is about 10 years. And then the University of Fiji started their program only this year. Okay, so I've been in this field for the last 20 years. And what I notice is universities are very willing to start journalism program, but they are not willing to fund it in the long term, right? And then it comes to be viewed as a resource center. So we have 8 journalism schools, but they're all struggling. In the Uni PNG Journalism School is the oldest in the Pacific region, older than even USP. And then you have Divine World, which had a pretty well-established communications program going for a number of years. I've got no idea how these 2 journalism schools are faring because we hardly hear of them nowadays. And then you have vocational institutes in the Solomon Islands, Tonga, Vanuatu, and Samoa. And these institutes were set up with Australian government funding. And as far as I know, from what I've been told and the feedback I've received, they're all struggling. So there is no research from any of these institutions simply because they lack the capacity. USP is only relatively better resourced and the only institution conducting regular research. Okay, so moving on, I discussed research in a bit more detail. So research as a component of media freedom and media development is often overlooked in the Pacific region. And I say this because research does not receive as much funding as journalism practice. So it's sort of like putting the cart before the horse in some ways. Maybe I'm biased, I don't know, but yeah, that's how I see it. Research is also lacking because journalism as an academic discipline in the Pacific region is still young and underdeveloped. That's Professor David Roby, and he's the foremost authority on Pacific media. He founded the Pacific Journalism Review, which is the only journal, I think, in the world that is focusing on Pacific media, and it's a very well-established journal. It's been around for a long time. Very good standard. And he's also the founder of the Pacific Media Center at the Auckland University of Technology. David Roby was also the former coordinator of USP Journalism and UPNG. And he's the one who recruited me at USP in 2001 because he felt we needed some local lecturers. And he has been supporting me and mentoring me since then. Unfortunately, David Roby retired recently, leaving only USP and PACMAS conducting research in Pacific media. PACMAS, by the way, is DFED's Pacific Media Capacity Building Project, and they are doing some really outstanding work in the region. Okay, next, I discuss some recent research by USP Journalism. That's the USP Journalism team. There's 3 of us. Those are our teaching assistants. First, I want to discuss the survey of Pacific journalists, profiles, and professional views. So we did a survey of Pacific journalist profiles. And this was the first such survey in the Pacific region in 30 years. So you can see how behind we are. Secondly, we did a content analysis of the news coverage of Fiji's 2018 elections. This is under peer review and for a DPA discussion paper. Okay, the first research, the survey has already been published. We did the content analysis because there was a lot of complaints about biased media coverage in Fiji, right? So we wanted to see whether or not it was true. We also did research on the prevalence and impact of sexual harassment in Fiji's news media. Our report was launched in Suva this month in partnership with the Fiji Women's Rights Movement, and we are developing a journal paper. And finally, we've done an analysis of the Fiji Media Industry Development Act. This is a 50-page analysis rather than a research paper. Okay, so let's just next discuss some of the findings of the research we have already completed. Some are completed and published, and some are still under peer review. So the first one I want to discuss is the Pacific journalist demographic profiles. And that's my co-author, right? A co-collaborator, Professor Volker Hanusch. He's with the University of Vienna. He got his PhD from the University of Queensland, and he worked for a while at the University of Queensland as well. So we surveyed 206 journalists in 9 countries, and we got a 70% response rate. We found that Pacific journalists are older, more experienced, and better educated than 30 years ago. Right? So we are making progress, even if incrementally. But we still lag behind counterparts in other countries and regions. If you look at the Worlds of Journalism survey, you will see that the Pacific journalism cohort is amongst the youngest in the world. Journalist youthfulness reflects high journalist attrition, as I was saying before, and the reason for this is uncompetitive salaries. And this is a feature of small media systems. Okay, so journalist attrition is a long-standing problem in the Pacific region, and it's very hard to find a solution, right? It's really hard to see where the solution might lie. And this makes building newsroom capacity a perpetual struggle, right? So people criticize the standard of journalism in the Pacific region. It's no one media organization's fault, neither is it any individual journalist's fault, right? They are much deeper rooted problems. Interestingly, what we found was that Fiji journalists are the youngest of the young, at an average age of 33 years, right? Why I say interestingly is because Fiji is able to pay its journalists relatively better than other Pacific Island countries. And for this reason, they should have a better retention rate, but they seem to be having the worst retention rate. And the reason for this, we feel, so Fiji faces a two-pronged problem. One is a retention problem that all other Pacific Island countries face, and the second is a hiring problem, right? That the other Pacific Island countries might not be facing. And the hiring problem is because of the Media Act. Potential recruits are spooked by the Media Act, and this is based on the feedback we've been getting from editors in Fiji. In terms of gender, we found broad parity. parity in the number, albeit large discrepancies in individual countries. So women make up 50% of the workforce, but only 4 in 10 hold management positions across the Pacific region. Okay, so these core findings show why we need regular research, as I was saying, to really understand the problem instead of blaming individual journalists and media organizations, right? So there's a tendency in the Pacific region to blame journalists and media organizations for what is said to be substandard journalism, practices and quality. But as I argue, the research shows the weaknesses are structural and also systematic. But what we see in the Pacific region, especially in Fiji, is that governments prefer legislation, which alone will do nothing to address the training and development deficit. And this is why legislation is seen as not just being limiting, but also self-serving on the part of governments. Okay, so the next research we look at is on the prevalence and impact of sexual harassment in the Fiji media. We'll just quickly discuss some of the findings. So we conducted a Google survey. We received 42 responses, which represents a 33% return rate. What we found was high levels of harassment, both at work and on the news beat. 2/3 reported incidents happening sometimes, and 1/4 reported as incidents as happening often. Now, sexual harassment in the workplace was higher than on the news beat. Besides work colleagues, our female journalists are under siege from businessmen, politicians, community leaders, and other upstanding male figures in society. The reporting rates we found to be low, reasons being shame, fear of reprisal, lack of confidence in the reporting system as well. Now, the lack of confidence in the reporting system might be justified because our research showed that in 5 out of 7 reported cases, there was no action taken. Okay, so this is the first such survey in the history of Fiji media, and it has blown the lid on a hidden and long-standing problem. We found some real horror stories in the in-depth interviews that we conducted. So this is a really serious problem that needs to be addressed. The findings beg the question, what might be the situation in other Pacific countries? Okay, so I think it might be as bad as in Fiji, if not worse, but we'll never know without further research. Okay, next we look at content analysis of the 2018 Fiji elections. Just some very quick results. So we found that we did a content analysis of how media covered Fiji's 2018 elections, and we found that 4 out of 5 media gave the Fiji First government overwhelming and overwhelmingly positive coverage. Opposition statements were ignored and they were denied the right of reply, as well as portrayed in negative terms by and large. The Fiji Times was the only exception. This Fiji's major national daily was the only exception, and their coverage tended to favor the opposition. So the question then is, why did the media report in this manner? There must be so many reasons, but we think one of the major reasons is one broadcast media in Fiji is owned by the state, and this is the major broadcast media in the country, the only media allowed to operate both a radio and a TV station, right? And this media's reach is unmatched in the country, in the broadest reach. So that's one broadcast media is owned by the state, and then one private print media enjoys exclusive advertising rights with the state for a number of years now. The one private TV station is owned by a government subsidized entity, and there was clear interference by the owners in editorial matters. Okay, so these are the reasons we are speculating on for the skewed coverage. Okay, next, see the interesting thing about the 2018 elections was that Fiji First, as the incumbent party, they won the election by a razor-thin 50.02%. Okay, so there must be all sorts of reasons why they won the election, but still, some of the questions we raise is, did biased media coverage make a difference? We have established that the media coverage was biased. Did it make a difference or not? And did the media swing the 2018 elections? So these are some very interesting questions that emerge from our research. So the research highlights, this particular research highlights the need to monitor the media because someone also needs to watch the watchdog in the Pacific region. Okay, so I'm going to now move on to the next topic. This is also a very controversial topic in the media in the Pacific, especially in the Solomon Islands and in Fiji, and this is journalism in fragile states. Okay, yeah, that's the correct slide. So this is a major issue, as I was saying, because of ethnic tensions in Fiji school culture. Right, so journalism is very complex in the Pacific region, perhaps more complex in Fiji than any other country. And okay, so because of ethnic tensions in Fiji, and because of the coup culture in Fiji, this is the government's main justification for the much derided Media Act in Fiji. Despite many complaints, the government is unmoved. The government's argument is that Fiji is a fragile state that needs stronger media controls. To some extent, this is valid, right? I would say that to some extent only, this is a valid point because certain media were deemed complicit in the 2000 coup. Because of the way they reported certain news, they were deemed complicit, and there is research to this effect. Okay, now Prof. Ratuva is based at the Macmillan Brown Center. At the time back then, he commented how hypercritical coverage of the Labour government inflamed the situation and emboldened the rebels. So the conditions for the coup were ripe, but he's saying that the media coverage might have tipped the balance. That's the allegation. The Fiji Times coverage was deemed hostile with traces of Australian-style journalism. So there was a lot of criticism about the Fiji Times coverage. And some people likened the coverage to the way Australian media cover events and politics. And this is not surprising if you consider that the Fiji Times at the time was owned by Rupert Murdoch. And the publisher, editor-in-chief, and training manager were all Australians from the News Corp stable. Right, so that's a very interesting link, I think, and we will discuss the alleged Australian influence in Fiji media and perhaps the 2000 coup. So that's Russell Hunter, and he was the Fiji Times editor-in-chief from 1995, and he came from the Australian newspaper. I think that's based in Melbourne. This was someone steeped in the Australian journalistic tradition, parachuted into Fiji, right, during a very volatile period. Now, Russell Hunter passed away recently, and I wish to acknowledge his contribution to journalism in Fiji. Although he was parachuted in the country, he stuck around for more than 10 years, and in the end, he was deported because of his writings, criticism of the 2006 coup. And he was a strong newspaper man, and he trained many of our journalists, right? So we're not going to take that away from him. So his views on journalism I find really interesting, and it gives us some idea of the Fiji Times approach, right? The Fiji Times was a very powerful instrument in Fiji in the 1990s. So this is what he says about media in Fiji, right? He had just come in the country. In fact, this is from an article that he wrote for an ANU publication. So he said that at independence, the media were pro-establishment and did not rock the boat too much, right? Which is a good point. But in the 1970s, Fiji was a much calmer place, and there wasn't much reason for the media to rock the boat. He goes on to add that greater competition pushed media into an independent and adventurous mind frame, which is right, because the 1990s was when the economic reforms occurred and the media sector started to expand in Fiji, right? But I would kind of hesitate to use the word adventurous, because in Fiji, adventurism can very quickly turn into misadventure, especially if it's in media. So he goes on to say that in media, there is no more deadly executioner than a bored audience. So here you can see the strong emphasis on competition and commercialism. right? So in Fiji, there is competition, but we don't have cutthroat competition, maybe like in Australia, right? There's no need for it in Fiji. The media sector is so small. He also said, this is Hunter's comment, lasting atmosphere of government and media tension is healthier for the national good than a cozy relationship. Okay, so I would say that this is debatable in Fiji's case, right? If you are having a lasting tension with the Fiji government, they will clamp down with very strong legislation, which is what has happened in Fiji's case. So Russell demonstrates a typical no holds barred, take no prisoners Australian journalistic approach, the truth at any cost. And it's questionable whether this template can have the same outcome in every context, including Fiji. Right? But these are very interesting views about journalism, and this is the kind of journalism, according to some research, was being practiced in a very volatile period during Fiji's history. I'm not saying it was wrong, right? It has its strengths, watchdog journalism. But I'd like to compare Hunter's views with another Fiji Times editor, Mr. Vijendra Kumar. The context is after the 1987 coup, when the Fiji Times was allowed to reopen under certain conditions. This included avoiding stories likely to incite societal tensions. I asked Vijendra whether the Fiji Times succumbed to censorship because the media are known to guard their independence, they're very strongly, they guard their independence very strongly. So I asked him whether in the media, the Fiji Times had succumbed to censorship, and this was his response. He said, in reality, you can't recognize a coup government, yet you cannot ignore its existence. It leaves the media between a rock and a hard place. And then he goes into it, but you don't have to be shouting from the rooftops to hold leaders to account. And then finally, he said, language is the most powerful tool in the world. And there are many ways to write and comment on public issues. Right? So you can see the contrasting approaches between a Fiji-born editor and an Australian editor. Okay, Mr. Vijendra Kumar left Fiji in the 1990s after the 1987 coup, and he was working at the Brisbane Courier Mail, I believe, for a number of years, and is now retired in Brisbane. So you can see with Vijendra, there is a more nuanced approach with a survivalist, longer-term outlook. But the problem with this approach is, once you give some ground to the government, they only want more, right? So it's a very complex problem, and it's a very slippery slope, I would say. Okay, the other person, I'm coming towards the end of my presentation. The other person I interviewed on this subject was Mr. Krishna Datt. He was a minister in the Labour government, the government that was toppled in the 2000 coup. And I asked about media coverage of his government, especially the Fiji Times, because the media coverage against the Chaudhry government was really hostile. So I asked him about the media coverage, what are your views of the coverage? And this is what he told me. I said, journalists abroad have a certain style in questioning, and they adopt a particular stance. This is fine in fully fledged democracies that can take it. But we have a fledgling democracy which hadn't got its roots dug in. And this type of journalism did a lot of damage. And then he goes on to add, we could score all this and see where the problem is, whether there was a reaction to the media image of the government. Okay, so some of my observations from this case study is that journalism should consider the national rather than a one-size-fits-all approach. But by the same token, ethnic tensions should not become an excuse to control the media, right? To excessively control the media, but try telling this to governments. The challenge is finding the balance between media rights and national stabilities, and both of these are very important for Fiji, but this is not an easy equation to solve by any means. Okay, towards the end of my presentation, I look at China and the Pacific media, and for this I draw from a publication, China's Global Media Strategy, right? These are the trends that are enveloping the Pacific media sector. So according to this report, China's global media strategy, published in 2021, the strategy is to shape media content around the world, and it affects every region. Right? The question is the Pacific region affected or not? The strategy relies on propaganda, disinformation, censorship, and influence. The sharper edge undermines democratic norms and erodes national sovereignty, right? This is something we need to be concerned about. And the targets include poor, institutionally fragile states, right? And we have our share of those in the Pacific region. Now, Cook's observation gelled with a paper on China's media strategy in the Pacific. This paper was written 1 year before the other paper, the one on the global media strategy. Now, this paper, I read this paper, and this paper indicates that China has designs on Pacific media, right, in case there were any doubts. Besides using own media outlets, it's engaging Pacific media to tell the China story. Okay, in one of my own papers, I cover examples of suspected Chinese influence. For example, in Vanuatu, there was a failed attempt to deport the Daily Post editor, Dan Mageri. Okay, so Dan's sin was questioning the presence of Chinese policemen on Vanuatu soil. For that, he was summoned to the Prime Minister's office and given a dressing down by none other than the Prime Minister himself, okay, which is really strange if you think about it. In PNG, there was a court order to stop protests against the Madang tuna processing project, which I believe is owned by Asian interests. And then in Fiji, there was the detention of New Zealand journalists investigating environment damage by a Chinese company. Okay, this company was recently fined $1 million in a Fiji court, and the $1 million some people feel is a pittance compared to the amount of damage that they caused. And finally, in the Solomon Islands, police chased journalists from Parliament, right? Journalists have a right to be in Parliament, but they were chased by police, and the PM attacked media over the security pact with China. Okay, now some obvious conclusions I make from these developments. First of all, it seems obvious that Chinese officials are acting against national media, state officials in some Pacific Island countries are acting against national media on behalf of Chinese elements. Media is the last line of defense against collusion by government and Chinese elements. So if the Chinese elements and government are colluding, right, if the government is sold out, then the last line of defense is obviously the media. But if financially struggling news media are co-opted by China, the last line of defense is gone. Right? Only yesterday, I was reading a disclosure by a PNG journalist from the National Courier. He was claiming that the High Commission, or the embassy in Port Moresby is bribing national journalists, giving them money. Of course, that has to be verified, but if true, that's very concerning. Financially vulnerable media are China's strength. And this is why research into impacts of digital disruption and COVID are crucial, right? We need to find out how our media might be financially ailing and how we might be able to assist them, if at all. Finally, the state of Pacific media is no longer just a national issue, but a regional concern. So it was never just a national issue, the state of national media. It's a regional concern, more so today than perhaps ever before, because of the presence of China. Okay, so I think my time is up. Thank you.